There are moments in life when silence teaches louder than command, when the wind itself seems to speak, waiting for someone wise enough to listen. In a remote desert range, a group of Marine snipers struggled to hit their mark until a quiet singledad, working maintenance in the background, picked up an old rifle and changed everything. Before we begin this true journey of humility, courage, and the kind of wisdom only life can forge, take a second to subscribe to Soul Moment Story, a place where stories of kindness, healing, and hidden heroism remind us that goodness still echoes in this world. Now, let the wind speak. The sun rose mercilessly over the Mojave training range, its heat radiating across miles of cracked earth and scorched brush. It was the kind of morning that tested a Marine's will before they even loaded their first round. At the far end of the range, a row of camouflage-clad figures adjusted their scopes, fighting not just distance, but the desert itself. The target sat 1734 yards away, a steel plate barely visible through the shimmer of heat waves. No one had touched it all morning. Miss. Again. Captain Mason Reed lowered his spotting scope and let out a frustrated grunt. He was tall, lean, and carried the kind of intensity that made lesser men correct their posture when he walked by. His jaw clenched as he turned to the shooter beside him. "That's 5 misses in a row, Corporal. You're aiming like the wind owes you a favor." The corporal's face flushed as he nodded, adjusted his cheek weld, and tried again. The crack of the rifle echoed across the range, followed by silence. No ting of impact, no celebration, just the wind. A few paces behind Lieutenant Clara Donovan, the unit's only female officer and a trained spotter, quietly noted the shifting wind patterns on her pad. Her brows furrowed. The numbers didn't add up. The anemometer read one direction, the dust another, the flags told a third story altogether. "It's like the wind has split personalities," she muttered. Captain Mason overheard her. "The wind doesn't lie. It's the shooter who doesn't listen." But even as he said it, uncertainty crept into his tone. That's when they noticed him. At the far end of the firing line, a solitary figure walked slowly along the edge of the observation berm, carrying a small metal toolbox and a rolled-up rag in his other hand. He wore worn desert boots, jeans faded by sun and time, and a dull green maintenance jacket with grease on the sleeves. His hair was shoulder-length, streaked with gray, and tied back in a loose band. His walk was calm, unhurried, as if he had nowhere in the world to be but here. "Who the hell let the janitor wander onto the range?" someone muttered. "He's not a janitor," Clara replied softly, squinting. "That's Dylan. Dylan Cole. Maintenance tech, I think. He fixes the HVAC units." Mason snorted. "Perfect. Maybe the wind messed with the air conditioner, too." Dylan said nothing. He stopped near the edge of the line, crouched by an unused shooting mat, and unrolled the cloth. Inside was not a wrench or a set of pliers, but an old, oil-worn M40 sniper rifle. Its fiberglass stock faded olive and scratched with time. The kind of weapon museums might display, not Marines. The murmurs grew louder. A few chuckles. Mason's voice rang out. "You planning to shoot that thing, Pops? Gonna teach us with your antique?" Dylan looked up slowly, his face calm, unreadable. "There are 3 wins here," he said, quietly. "Not 1. Mason raised an eyebrow. 3 wins. Dylan nodded toward the range. "You're watching the wrong flags. One's from the surface heat. One's up high, driving left to right. And one's wrapping around that small ridge out there, see it? Between the 4th and 5th saguaro cactus. They didn't. Not clearly. Not yet. The machines read one of them. But they don't hear the others," Dylan continued. "You don't just read the wind. You have to listen." More laughter followed. Clara didn't laugh. She stepped forward. "What do you mean by listen?" Dylan glanced at her, and something passed between them, a flicker of understanding. Not flirtation. Something quieter, a recognition of depth. Every ripple of heat, every shimmer off the sand, every blade of grass, he said. It's all trying to tell you something. If you stop talking and start listening, you'll know where your bullet is going before you fire it. Clara looked at the horizon, then at her scope, then back at him. What's your name, Dylan Cole? You ever serve? He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've done some listening in my time. He lay down slowly on the mat, steady hands unwrapping the M40's leather sling, adjusting the old-school scope. No spotter, no kestrel meter, no ballistic computer, just eyes, wind, and steel. Okay, Grandpa Mason called out. Let's see what a janitor can do. Dylan didn't react. He closed his eyes, took one long breath. Then he opened them and stared downrange. The flags flapped east. The grass danced west. The heat shimmered like water. Clover grass near the ridge is telling the truth, he said. He adjusted 2 clicks left. Lower wind is a liar. He clicked again. Now. Listen. The M40 cracked like thunder. Silence. Then Tang, the faint, unmistakable sound of steel being struck dead center. A perfect hit. No wind meter. No tech. Just instinct. The entire line went quiet. Even Mason said nothing. Clara blinked, stunned. She had seen plenty of good shots, but that wasn't just a shot. That was a statement. As Dylan slowly stood up and began wrapping his rifle back in the cloth, she caught a glimpse of ink along the inside of his wrist, just visible beneath his rolled sleeve. For my daughter. He didn't stay for applause. He didn't look for recognition. He just walked back toward the utility shed as the wind began to shift again. But somehow, even that seemed to lean in his favor. The shot still echoed in the minds of those present, long after the steel plate had stopped vibrating. For the next few minutes, no one said much. The crack of that single bullet had shattered more than just metal. It had pierced pride routine, and something deeper no one quite knew how to name. The line of Marine snipers returned to their scopes, but every movement seemed more cautious now. Every breath carried the unspoken question. Who the hell is Dylan Cole? Lieutenant Clara Donovan stood with her arms crossed, staring at the path where Dylan had walked back toward the utility bay. Her normally analytical mind, built on patterns, angles, ballistics, and tactics, was strangely quiet. She wasn't just impressed. She was unsettled. That man had made a shot without data, without support, without ego, and he'd hit truth. Later that day, as the sun began its descent toward the ragged mountains, Clara found herself walking toward the same maintenance shed that Dylan had disappeared into. She told herself it was curiosity, or perhaps professionalism. After all, any civilian who handled a weapon on a federal range was at the very least a subject worth debriefing. But in her chest, something warmer stirred. Something she hadn't felt in years. The sound of a radio drifted out of the open door, low jazz, not military frequencies. Inside, surrounded by tool benches, spare air filters, and coiled wires, Dylan sat hunched over a disassembled generator. Hands, steady movements, unhurried. Clara knocked lightly against the metal frame. Dylan didn't look up. Afternoon, Lieutenant. Her eyes narrowed slightly. How did you... I heard the boots, he said, simply tightening a bolt. Marines walk different than contractors. You got an ear for footsteps, too. Some people listen to radios. Some listen to wind. I prefer the ground. She stepped inside. The air smelled of oil and dust, and something faintly citrus orange, cleaning solvent maybe. She sat on a nearby crate. You embarrassed my CO today. Dylan finally glanced up. There was no smugness in his face, just calm. That wasn't my intent. Then what was he set the wrench down and wiped his hands on a rag. to remind them, and maybe myself, that some things can't be measured by digital readouts and laser rangefinders. Some truths still need to be felt. She leaned back, arms still crossed. Is that how you made the shot? Feeling Dylan tilted his head, studying her. No, not just feeling. Observation. Pattern. Patience. And about 25 years of experience, there it was. A glimpse. The first crack in the mystery. You were in, she asked quietly. Dylan nodded once. A long time ago. Long enough that nobody remembers, which suits me fine. You don't carry yourself like a janitor, because I'm not. I maintain systems, machines, air, water, occasionally truth. He gave her a half smile. She didn't return it, not yet. Her gaze dropped to his wrist again, and the faint edge of the tattoo she'd seen earlier. For my daughter, she read aloud. You got kids. One, Camilla, 11. Lives with my mother-in-law while I work base contracts. Keeps her in a better school district. She must be proud. I hope she's safe. That's enough. There was silence. Not awkward. Not tense. Just space. The kind that only exists between people who respect stillness. Clara broke it first. You said something earlier about the wind lying. I said the machines hear one truth, but the world speaks in more than one voice. She nodded slowly. So what do you hear when you lie there, eye against the scope? Dylan looked toward the open doorway, where the wind had begun to pick up again. Dust curled in tiny spirals across the asphalt. I hear confusion, he said, conflict between levels. But beneath it, I hear the real wind, the one that doesn't fight, just flows. If you learn to listen to that one, you don't need second guesses. The bullet knows where to go. Clara stared at him for a long time. Then she surprised herself. She asked the one question she hadn't dared ask anyone in years. Do you miss it? Dylan didn't pretend not to understand. He answered slowly. I miss the simplicity, the clarity of purpose, but not the noise, not the politics, not the loneliness that comes when the mission's over and you're just a name on a file. He looked down at his hands. I came back from my last deployment with metal scars and a daughter who'd forgotten what my voice sounded like. So I left the uniform, started over. Clara's throat tightened. That's brave. He shook his head. No, that was necessity. Bravery is staying present for the things that matter, not hiding behind hero stories. She didn't know what to say to that, because in that moment, she realized something painful and true. She had been hiding behind the mission for years. Outside, the wind kicked up more dust. Clara stood. Well, you're going to have a lot of curious Marines tomorrow. Let them be curious, Dylan said, returning to his tools. Curiosity is the first step to humility. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Dylan, he looked up. I think the steel target is still ringing. He smiled. Good. Let it ring. Maybe it'll echo into something deeper. And then she left, stepping out into the desert wind, a little more quiet, a little more human than when she walked in. The following morning, the firing line was quieter than usual. No one joked. No one bragged. The steel target at 734 yards still bore the faint gray mark of Dylan's bullet from the day before. No one had hit it since. No one had even come close. Captain Mason Reed stood with a scowl on his face, arms crossed, watching as his Marines prepped their gear. He'd hardly slept the night before. His pride, though intact, had been rattled. But pride was a dangerous thing in the desert. Lieutenant Clara Donovan arrived just after sunrise, her hair tucked neatly beneath her cap, her spotting scope slung across her shoulder. Her expression, as always, was composed, but something in her eyes had changed. A quiet curiosity, a humility that had crept in like dust under the door. Then once again he appeared. Dylan Cole. Same worn boots, same faded maintenance jacket. Only this time the cloth he carried wasn't wrapped up like a mystery. It was laid flat across his forearm, open for the world to see. The M40 sniper rifle. It wasn't a modern piece of equipment. There were no Picatinny rails, no suppressors, no carbon fiber tricks. It was old-school Marine Corps steel and fiberglass, a Remington 700 action bedded in a Macmillan A1 stock with the original uneartled 10X fixed power scope. Its lenses cleaned, but weathered edges dulled with time. Dylan set the rifle down gently on the prep table beside the line, his hands treating it less like a weapon and more like a memory. One of the younger Marines leaned toward another and whispered, "Is that?" "Original issue," Clara answered before anyone else could. "M40A1, Vietnam era. That's not a replica." Mason stepped forward, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That thing belongs in a museum." Dylan didn't look up. So do most truths. Doesn't mean they've stopped working. He unzipped a canvas pouch and retrieved a small oil-stained bottle. Without rush, he began dabbing a cloth along the rifle's bolt carrier, cleaning away invisible dust, as if the ritual itself held more meaning than the act. "You mind telling us why you're carrying around a relic from 50 years ago?" Mason asked, folding his arms. Dylan paused, eyes fixed on the weapon. "She was issued to me in 1992, he said. "But her soul is older than that." Clara raised an eyebrow. "She—" Dylan nodded almost wistfully. "Her name's Faith. You don't take a shot like yesterday without it." There were chuckles, scoffs, but less than the day before. Dylan lifted the rifle, nestled the butt into his shoulder, and sighted downrange without chambering around. His breathing slowed. "You know what the problem is with modern rifles," he said softly. "Too quiet. Too smooth. They don't speak to you anymore. The recoil is muffled. The sound is dampened. The steel's too sterile." He lowered the rifle. "This one. She talks. Every shot's a conversation." Mason stepped closer. "That sounds like superstition." Dylan turned to face him, calm and unbothered. "It's not superstition, Captain. It's history. And discipline." He held up the bolt assembly, turning it in the light. "You feel every vibration. You don't pull the trigger, you persuade it." Clara found herself stepping closer, fascinated. "You never upgraded." Dylan's smile was faint. "Why would I upgrade what I already trust with my life?" He laid the bolt back into the receiver, locked it into place with a soft click. The rifle was whole again. Mason scoffed. "You can't honestly believe that ancient thing can outshoot our M2010s or MK13s. Dylan shrugged. "Depends on who's pulling the trigger. A tool's only as smart as its master." A subtle burn, but it landed like a whisper, not a slap. Mason clenched his jaw but said nothing. Just then, Clara noticed something etched faintly into the fiberglass stock, barely visible through the years of wear and recoating. "Is that a name?" Dylan hesitated. Clara leaned in. She read aloud, "Camilla." A small, curved engraving. Not factory-made. Hand-carved. Precise. "Your daughter's name," she said gently. Dylan nodded, not quite looking at her. "First time I fired this rifle in combat, I was on Overwatch near Kunar Province. Took a shot through 4 layers of wind, dropped a Taliban spotter before he could call in mortar fire. 15 seconds later, a child ran out from the rocks. A little girl. Looked just like Camilla. Same eyes." He paused, swallowing dryly. "That night, I carved her name on the stock, so I'd never forget why I shoot, and why not, to when it isn't right." The range fell into a rare stillness. It was no longer just a story about a gun. It was about a man who had carried ghosts and had chosen to plant flowers instead of bitterness. Mason's voice broke the silence. It was lower now, almost respectful. "You still shoot only when silence won't work." Dylan looked around at the team, their young faces, their gleaming gear. You're all taught to chase perfection, laser range precision, minute of angle accuracy. But the truth is, you need to fail first. You need to miss. That's how you learn to listen. He walked over to the shooting mat, lowered himself into position, and sighted in once more. Your best shots won't come from certainty. They'll come from humility. Clara stood beside Mason, now her voice low. He's not just shooting targets, she whispered. He's teaching philosophy. Mason said nothing. He just watched closely this time. Dylan didn't fire. He simply lay there for a moment, one eye through the scope, the other closed, breathing in sync with the wind. Finally he stood and turned toward the young Marines. When you're ready, he said, I'll be here. Not to teach you how to shoot, but to teach you why you shoot. And with that, he lifted the rifle, gently cradled it in his arms, and walked toward the edge of the range. Clara watched him disappear into the light. For the first time in her life, a rifle looked holy. The heat had begun to rise, shimmering off the sand like a living thing. It was mid-morning, and the steel target, 734 yards away, now seemed more illusion than object warping, through waves of desert air, nearly impossible to see with the naked eye. A few Marines had attempted shots already. None had connected. Most hadn't even come close. The firing line was silent. Then came the scrape of worn boots on gravel. Dylan Cole stepped forward without fanfare. No announcement, no preamble. Just the slow, deliberate movement of a man who didn't need to prove anything, but somehow still had everything to say. Slung across his shoulder was Faith, the M40 rifle, that looked as though it had survived wars and whispered through all of them. Captain Mason Reed crossed his arms and muttered under his breath, "Let's see if yesterday was a fluke." Clara didn't reply. She was watching Dylan's hand, steady, unhurried, almost reverent. He unrolled his mat, knelt, and laid the rifle before him. The action clicked open with a clean metallic sound. He removed a single round from a small cloth pouch. Not a magazine, not a box, just one round, polished by hand and time. "No spotter?" Mason asked aloud, his voice just loud enough to be heard down the line. Dylan didn't answer. He was already listening, not to Mason, but to the wind. Clara stepped forward this time without hesitation. She crouched a few feet behind, and to the side, quietly slipping her spotting scope into place. She didn't ask. She didn't offer help. She simply observed. Dylan lay prone now, the stock of Faith pressed firmly into his shoulder. His cheek rested lightly against the worn comb, one eye closed the other, looking through glass that had seen deserts, jungles, and mountains. He didn't breathe heavily. He didn't blink rapidly. He settled. Then he spoke so low Clara almost didn't catch it. "Ko ben kia jang noi doi." Clara leaned forward. "What did you say?" he repeated, this time in English. The flag downrange is lying. Her eyes narrowed. Why he didn't look away from the scope. Because it's responding to the top current, not the bottom. See the shimmer along the sand 30 yards in front of the second ridge. It's bending east, low-level shear wind. Clara adjusted her lens. Now she saw it. The tiny wisps of grass curling ever so slightly in the opposite direction of the flags. "How do you don't look for patterns?" "Look for contradictions," Dylan said. "Truth lives in the argument." He clicked 2 MOA left, then a half click down. Then he did something no one expected. He closed his eyes for 5 full seconds. Then he opened them and fired. The crack of the M40 rolled across the range like a thunderclap. No suppressor, no fancy recoil dampeners. Just raw, beautiful combustion. There was silence. 1, 2, ting. The shot landed dead center, a perfect hit, from a vintage rifle, in triple-layer wind, on a target barely visible through the glare. The sound rang out like a bell, not just of metal, but of truth. A collective gasp rose behind the line. No one spoke. Even Mason froze. Clara's heart pounded, though her body remained still. She couldn't take her eyes off Dylan, not just because of the shot, but because of how little it seemed to change him. He didn't smile. He didn't rise to take in the glory. He stayed prone, as if still listening for something only he could hear. Then slowly, he stood. Clara saw it again, the tattoo on his wrist. For my daughter. Only this time, it meant something more. This wasn't just a sentimental phrase. It was an oath. The silence broke with footsteps. Heavy ones. Colonel Marcus Hayes, the base commander, strode onto the range with a pace that sent tension through the spines of every Marine in uniform. His presence was thunderous, even without words. Behind him, 2 officers and a camera crew from Training Command trailed like shadows. Colonel Hayes stopped directly in front of Dylan. Then, to everyone's shock, he saluted. Chief Warrant Officer Dylan Cole. It's been too long. The world froze. Mason's eyes widened. Clara blinked, processing the words. Chief Warrant Officer. This wasn't just some ex-Marine with a vintage rifle. This was a former Tier 1 operator, a living legend. Hayes turned to the crowd of stunned Marines. For those of you who've forgotten your doctrine, the colonel said this man wrote most of it. He gestured toward the steel plate. He's the one behind the wind-reading manual. He made the longest confirmed counter-sniper kill in a hostile sandstorm during the Battle of Ton Hoa, 2003. He didn't just survive the chaos, he brought order to it. Dylan looked down, uncomfortable. I'm just a mechanic now. Hayes shook his head. You're still the Wind Whisperer. The name dropped like a stone into still water. The Wind Whisperer, a nickname whispered in sniper circles, half legend, half warning. No one had seen him in over a decade. Now he stood before them in grease-stained sleeves, with eyes that had read more than wind. Mason stepped forward, humbled. Sir, I didn't know. Dylan turned to him, his voice calm. We all forget what matters when we focus too much on who's talking and not what's being said. Mason looked down, then nodded. Clara watched it all unfold like a dream. It was as if the desert had peeled back a curtain and revealed a hidden temple. And in it stood a teacher, not a soldier. And something inside her, something old, armored, and tired, cracked open. Because Dylan hadn't come to prove anything. He'd come to remind them all of what they had forgotten. And in doing so, he'd awakened her. The desert had grown quieter after the shot. Not in sound, the wind still whispered over the dunes. The flag still fluttered weakly at the range perimeter, but in presence. Something had shifted. A sense of awe, of reckoning. Dylan Cole had delivered a single shot that shattered expectations and unearthed a legend. But he didn't bask in the glory. He stood off to the side of the firing line, now rolling up his mat and wiping down Faith with the same careful hands, as if he'd just repaired an old air compressor instead of out shooting a full squad of Marine snipers. Clara Donovan remained nearby, notebook forgotten. In her hands, gaze locked on the man who had somehow become the quiet center of the entire base. That's when the wind shifted, not just in the sand, but in energy. A low rumble approached from beyond the outer perimeter, 3 matte black Humvees, in convoy formation tires, kicking up a long tail of dust. The convoy wasn't scheduled. No one had radioed for inspection. Mason stiffened. But now within seconds, the vehicles pulled to a halt near the observation post. The front passenger door opened with a sharp metallic clunk, and out stepped Colonel Marcus Hayes. He wore no sunglasses. He didn't need them. His presence blocked more light than any pair of lenses ever could. Behind him, 2 base officers and a civilian DoD liaison stepped out. One carried a clipboard, the other a camera bag. But all eyes were on the colonel. He didn't scan the line. He didn't ask questions. He walked directly toward Dylan Cole. Dylan didn't flinch. He simply stood up straight, rifle cradled in the crook of his arm, eyes meeting the colonel's without a flicker of fear or pride. Then, to the shock of every Marine on the line, Colonel Hayes saluted. Chief Warrant Officer Cole, he said, his voice low, formal, and just a touch reverent. "It's been an honor to finally find you again." Clara's breath caught. "Chief Warrant Officer." The whispers rippled down the line like dominoes. "He's still active duty," someone hissed. "No retired." Then why the salute? Because some ghosts still wear their rank even off paper. Dylan hesitated only a moment before returning the salute, precise and crisp. Not showy. Just earned. "I didn't expect visitors, Colonel. You should have," Hayes said. Word of that shot made it to training command before the steel cooled. They didn't believe it. "I did." He glanced at the camera bag. "We're documenting updated sniper doctrine for the Joint Readiness Program. We were 2 days into filming when someone mentioned your name. We diverted immediately." Dylan exhaled quietly. "I'm just a maintenance contractor." "No, son. You're the author of Coal Wind Doctrine, and every Marine sniper in this unit is unknowingly quoting your work every time they make a wind call." He turned to the unit, now standing half at attention, half in disbelief. "You all are lucky. Most never get to meet the people whose work they memorize. Today you're standing next to the man who redefined what long-range precision means in active war zones." Dylan shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't come here for that." "Then why did you come?" Mason asked, not with defiance this time, but with genuine curiosity. Dylan glanced toward Clara, then back at Mason. "To make sure my daughter grows up in a world where silence still matters more than noise." A strange silence followed. Not empty, but thick, charged. Clara broke it, stepping forward. "Sir?" "I think we'd all benefit from hearing Mr. Cole's perspective." Hayes gave a small smile. "Lieutenant Donovan, is it?" "Yes, sir. You agree with his doctrine?" She nodded. "I do now." Hayes turned back to Dylan. "So do I. And I want your voice on record officially. We're updating training modules next quarter. We want your insight in your own words, not just as a ghost in the margins." Dylan's jaw flexed, but he didn't immediately answer. Clara stepped closer. Her voice was lower now, only for him. "You don't have to become someone again," she said. "Just help them see what they've forgotten." Dylan looked at her, and in that glance she saw it. The weight he carried. The years he'd spent trying to disappear for the sake of peace, for the sake of Camilla. But also the tug, the whisper of legacy calling him back, not to glory, but to meaning. He turned to Hayes. "I'll consider it, but only if it doesn't interfere with my contract hours." Hayes let out a quiet laugh, still practical. "Still a father," Dylan replied. They shook hands, and the desert wind stirred again. The Humvees left not long after kicking up sand in their wake. The camera crew had taken a few wide shots, no interviews, just visuals. Hayes made it clear they would wait for Dylan's decision, but Clara could feel it. The energy had changed. Back at the barracks, whispers of the Wind Whisperer spread like wildfire. Recruits pulled up archived combat reports. Snipers compared notes. One even found an old grainy photo Dylan, 20 years younger, in ghillie suit, crouched on a rocky Afghan ledge with Faith across his lap. But Dylan, he didn't change. That evening he returned to the utility shed, wiped down generator coils, refilled coolant lines, as if nothing had happened. But Clara knew better. She found him sitting on a crate behind the shed, watching the sun bleed over the range. "I didn't want any of that," he said, sensing her approach. "I know. They'll try to drag me back. You don't have to go. You're already doing more good right here." He looked at her. "I just wanted to raise a daughter. Not a doctrine." She sat beside him. "Maybe you're doing both." A long pause. The sky turned orange, then violet, and the wind, as always, spoke. But this time, Clara was beginning to understand its language. It had been less than 24 hours since the convoy left, yet the energy across the base had shifted entirely. The younger Marines now walked past the maintenance shed with a touch more straightness in their backs. The snipers stole glances toward the firing line with renewed discipline, and Captain Mason Reed, once the loudest voice on the range, had grown quieter, more deliberate. But Dylan Cole, he hadn't changed. That morning he arrived at the range at the same time as always. Worn boots, olive drab jacket, and that same small cloth wrap tucked under his arm. The M40 inside it didn't gleam with oil or glory. It simply existed the way mountains existed. Quiet. Enduring. Colonel Hayes had arranged an informal session. Not a class, not a lecture, a walkthrough. Dylan had agreed on one condition: no titles, no cameras, and no salutes. If they wanted to learn, they'd have to leave rank at the door and listen like people, not soldiers. Clara stood by the chalkboard in the small briefing hut, her arms folded, but her gaze soft. She had chosen to observe silently, not to supervise, not to evaluate, just to see. The room was full. 15 Marines, all seated, notebooks, open pens ready. Dylan stepped in, nodded to the room, and walked straight to the back of the chalkboard, where a piece of white string had been pinned up, running across like a clothesline. He took a marker and drew a simple curve in the air. This, he began. Voice even as the wind at eye level. He made another more jagged line above it. This is what your kestrel reads. Then a third line, faint and low. And this is the wind the bullet actually feels. He turned around. Which one do you trust, Silence? A hand went up. One of the younger corporals. The third one, Dylan nodded. That's right. But you didn't know that last week. Why? The corporal hesitated. Because we didn't see it. No, Dylan corrected gently. Because you were trained to measure before you were trained to observe. He placed the marker down, walked to the window. Wind is not a number. It's a language. Outside, the sun beat down on the sand as the team reassembled at the firing range. But this time, they didn't bring their rangefinders first. They brought themselves. Dylan instructed them to walk the line barefoot. No rifles, no scopes, just boots off and eyes open. Feel where the sand shifts, where the wind stings, where the heat ripples upward. They hesitated at first, skeptical, even self-conscious. But slowly, one by one, they obeyed. Captain Mason stood off to the side, arms crossed. Clara approached him. You joining them? Mason shook his head. I'm not sure what he's doing yet. You don't have to understand it to learn from it, she said softly. Dylan crouched near a small hillock, gesturing for the others to join him. Most of you want to shoot faster. Cleaner. With more tech. That's the modern way. It's efficient, sure. But it's also dangerous. He picked up a handful of sand and let it fall slowly through his fingers. The best shot you'll ever take is the one you don't need to. The Marines exchanged glances. It wasn't the kind of wisdom found in training manuals. Respect isn't built in the trigger pull, Dylan continued. It's built when you know why not to shoot. When you know the life at the other end of the scope, and you hesitate long enough to let peace breathe. A long pause. Then Dylan stood and turned to Mason. Captain? You want to show them how your last 5 shots went? Mason stiffened. He was not a man who enjoyed being put on the spot. But he nodded. He walked to the mat, loaded his modern MK-13, and settled in. This time he took his time, applied what he had just heard, watched not the digital readout, but the curl of grass, the shimmer of heat. He fired. Ting, a solid hit. Another round, another impact. By the third shot, a small grin had crept onto his face. When he stood, he looked at Dylan and offered something rarer than praise. A hand. Sir Mason said quietly. I was wrong. Dylan didn't hesitate. He shook it. We all were once. Later that afternoon, Clara found Dylan seated alone under the partial shade of a maintenance awning, oiling Faith as if she were no more than an old garden tool. But the way he moved, careful, precise, told a different story. You know, she said, approaching, I've sat through lectures from PhDs, generals, and psychologists, but no one ever got a room full of Marines to shut up and listen like that. Dylan didn't look up. They weren't listening to me. They were. They were listening to themselves. I just gave them permission. She smiled, sat down beside him on the concrete edge. You don't want to lead them, but they'd follow you anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then, leadership isn't about being followed. It's about making sure no one gets lost. Clara studied his face, the soft creases at the edges of his eyes, the calm strength beneath his silence. I think they've already started to find something in you. Dylan looked down at the rifle. His fingers brushed over the carved name, Camila. I just hope my daughter never has to know what wind sounds like when it's trying to kill. Clara said nothing, because some truths didn't need answers, only understanding. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert gold, the Marines gathered around Dylan without orders or agenda. No ranks, no drills, just quiet conversation. Questions. Laughter. Respect earned, not commanded. And as Clara watched from a distance, she felt something shift in her chest. Not just admiration, but healing. Because for the first time in a long time, someone was teaching these soldiers, and her, how to be human again. The sun had dipped low behind the jagged hills, casting long shadows across the range. Most of the Marines had packed up and returned to the barracks. The chatter was lighter now, less about stats and groupings, more about what they had felt. And in quiet corners of the base, they spoke his name with a kind of reverence they hadn't known how to give the day before. But Dylan Cole wasn't there to hear it. He sat alone on the steps of the observation hut boots, dusty elbows resting on his knees, and a metal thermos in hand. The coffee inside was lukewarm, bitter, and unceremoniously brewed from a rusted drip machine inside the maintenance shed. He didn't mind. It was honest. He raised it to his lips and took a slow sip. The wind had calmed to a soft, steady breeze. For once, the desert was breathing gently. Behind him, boots approached, soft ones, deliberate. He didn't turn. He already knew. You still drink that awful base coffee. Clara Donovan's voice carried a smile. Dylan raised the cup slightly. Tradition and pain builds character. She stepped forward and held out a small paper cup with steam still rising from the lid. Or you could drink this. Civilian mess has a proper espresso machine. I bribed the cook with a spare ammo logbook. He accepted it with a quiet smirk. That's blackmail, Lieutenant. Efficient negotiation, she corrected. They sat together in silence, watching the last orange light fade into dusty blue. The day was done, but neither of them seemed ready to leave. Clara broke the silence first. You made quite the impact today. Dylan shrugged. I didn't say much. Exactly. She sipped her coffee. There's a strange power in how quiet you are. He gave a dry chuckle. Most people find it unnerving. I used to. Now I find it grounding. A beat passed between them. Dylan stared out at the range. You know, I used to think silence was a shield, a way to protect what I had left. Keep the noise out. But lately, I think it's just the only language I have left that doesn't hurt. Clara nodded slowly. I understand that more than I want to admit. He looked at her now properly, not with formality, but with the kind of attention that only those who've spent too long alone know how to give. She didn't flinch from it. Why did you leave the Corps? She asked softly. He exhaled through his nose. Not a sigh, just the release of something long held. My wife died, he said. Car crash. Out of nowhere. Camilla was 5. I was deployed when it happened. Took me 3 days to get home. Clara lowered her gaze. I'm sorry. I missed her first words, her first steps, her first day of kindergarten. And then I missed the moment she needed me most. He took another sip. So I left. Not because the mission was over, but because I realized my real mission had just begun. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. That takes more courage than staying. Dylan didn't respond right away. He stared at the wind flag near the 700-yard mark, now still barely moving. She had this little habit, he said, of standing by the window at sunset and pretending the wind was talking to her. Said it whispered things only she could hear. I used to laugh. His voice cracked just slightly. Now I listen for it too. Clara looked away, blinking fast. I lost someone too, she said quietly. Not to death, to distance. A fiancé, another officer. We were stationed together until we weren't. I stayed. He didn't. Took a job at Boeing. Left the uniform and everything with it, including me. You stayed for duty, I stayed for me, she admitted. Because I didn't want to be someone's afterthought. I thought if I proved myself enough, I'd stop needing anyone. Dylan nodded slowly. And did you? She shook her head, smiling bitterly. No. I just got better at pretending I didn't. There was something beautiful in their silence, not empty, not heavy, just honest. Dylan leaned back on his elbows, letting the fading sky spill over him. You know what I miss, he said. What conversations like this? The kind without objectives, without ranks. Just two people who remember what it's like to listen without waiting to reply. Clara glanced at him. You think it's possible to have that again after everything? Maybe not often, he said. But maybe. Here and now is enough. She smiled genuinely this time. Then, surprising herself, she leaned her shoulder against his just briefly. No words, no explanation. He didn't move away. The stars had begun to come out one by one. Dylan looked up. You ever notice how the desert holds heat even after the sun's gone? Yeah, Clara said. Like it remembers. He nodded. Some memories are worth keeping. They sat that way for a long while, not close enough to be intimate, not distant enough to be strangers, and somewhere between 2 paper cups of coffee and the rising of the first full star, something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. The beginning of something real. The desert, when silent, could speak volumes. It was in that silence that Dylan Cole began his first real lesson. No lecture hall, no bullet points, no PowerPoint slides. Just the open range, the early morning light, and the distant hum of wind stirring through mesquite trees. 15 Marines stood on the sand, in a loose half-circle, their rifles slung across their backs, notebooks forgotten in cargo pockets, scopes left behind in the hut. Captain Mason Reed stood among them, quiet now, more student than commander. And Clara Donovan. She stood off to the side, arms folded, eyes on Dylan, watching not just what he said, but how he was. Dylan faced them with nothing in his hands but a single piece of chalk. He walked toward the long steel shipping container behind the range and knelt. With one slow stroke, he drew a circle on its side about the size of a human heart. Then he turned to the group. Today, he said, we're not shooting. We're listening. A few of the younger recruits glanced at each other. One raised a hand. Sir, listen to what exactly? Dylan smiled faintly. To what's always there. The world doesn't go quiet just because we stop talking. It only gets easier to hear. He picked up a handful of sand and let it run between his fingers. The wind doesn't scream. It whispers. If you're not still enough, you miss it. He gestured toward the hills. Go. Spread out. 20 minutes. No speaking. No tech. Just your eyes, Your breath? And the wind. They obeyed at first hesitantly. Some walked toward the ridgeline, others knelt by the sagebrush. One lay prone in the dirt, ear to the ground. Clara followed the path leading toward a cluster of sun-bleached rocks. She sat back, straight eyes closed, feeling the heat of the stone at her spine. For the first time in months, maybe years, she wasn't calculating distances or reviewing protocols. She was just there. And slowly, something shifted. The wind didn't just brush her cheek, it told her something. Subtle changes. Pulses of heat that rose in spirals. The shift of small shadows moving in rhythm she'd never noticed before. In the stillness, she could almost hear Dylan's voice, even though he wasn't near. The wind doesn't lie, but it doesn't explain either. 20 minutes later, the Marines returned. Some were contemplative, some visibly shaken. Private Morales spoke first. "Sir, I swear I heard the wind change right before it passed that hill." Dylan nodded. "It always changes. But what you heard was your mind getting quiet enough to finally notice." He pointed toward the container again. "You'll never hit that circle in combat unless you understand what the air between you and it wants. Every bullet rides a river of air. If you don't read the river, you drown." He turned to Clara. "You hear anything?" She didn't answer immediately. Then I heard myself, thinking, judging, planning. Then, nothing. Just breathing. "Good," he said. "That's the sound of clarity." Over the next few days, Dylan trained them differently. No shooting drills, no competitions. Instead, he taught them how to read mirage shimmer, how to spot temperature inversion layers, how to observe the tilt of grass and the motion of insects to determine micro changes in airflow. He made them build crude wind indicators from thread and tape positioned, not at eye level, but at ankle height. Bullets don't fly at 6 feet. They dance through the dirt, he told them. The team, skeptical at first, began to transform. Their questions changed. Their language shifted. Mason, once proud and impatient, now spent 15 minutes each morning studying a single flag on a 10-yard line, just watching how its edge curled differently with each gust. Clara noticed it too, not just in the way the Marines moved, but in herself. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders loosened. She had stopped checking her watch. She had, without realizing it, begun to feel the wind. One afternoon, Dylan walked past her as she sat near the edge of the range sketching in her notebook. Not coordinates or diagrams, just impressions. Patterns. Arrows showing the direction of wind flow across uneven terrain. He paused, glanced down. Nice shading on that westward push. Clara looked up, surprised. "You draw," he nodded. "Used to sketch wind tunnels, airflow simulations. Back when I taught at Quantico. You taught there before I left." "Yeah, briefly, until I realized I couldn't teach what I didn't live." Clara shut the notebook, stood. "You're doing it now. Teaching living." He gave her a long look, then softly, "Maybe." A long pause. "Why do you call it whispering?" she asked. The wind. Dylan looked out across the sand, where the light bent just slightly above the range. "Because a whisper isn't meant for everyone. It's intimate. You have to lean in, give it space, show it respect. That's how the wind speaks. It only tells the truth to people willing to be quiet long enough to hear it." Clara smiled, slow and full this time. "Sounds like you're not just training snipers." "I'm not." And in the fading sunlight, the desert wind rose again, gentle, steady knowing. That evening, while the rest of the base drifted toward routine, Clara found Dylan back at the maintenance shed, sitting with Faith across his lap, gently cleaning the scope. She leaned against the doorway. "May I ask something?" He looked up. "Always." "Do you miss being needed?" He paused. "Then I miss being useful. Not in combat, in clarity, in helping people see what's right in front of them. Clara stepped forward, voice soft. Well, you're doing that. For them, for me, she said. Dylan, for the first time in a long time, didn't look away. The desert had a rhythm of its own, one that no man could master, only respect. That morning the rhythm turned violent. It began subtly. The wind came earlier than usual, sharper, coarser. The small flags Dylan had taught the Marines to set up began snapping sideways, their seams fluttering like distressed wings. Clara squinted toward the ridgeline. A faint haze was building too early, too fast. Dylan stepped beside her, eyes fixed on the horizon. Sandstorm. He didn't answer immediately. Then, she's coming. The Marines were halfway through their wind drills, lying prone at 600 yards mid-exercise, when the first gust hit with teeth. Not just wind, but heat and sound. A growl across the landscape. Captain Mason stood beside a young corporal correcting his angle when the dust kicked up hard, stinging the side of his face. He wiped his eyes. The air tasted like iron and static. "Sir," a voice called out. "We've lost visual on the 800 target." Mason looked through the scope. All he saw was blur, heat-shimmered dust distortion. The desert had vanished into a sepia haze. A second voice, more panicked. "Should we fall back to base?" Clara shouted over the wind. "Visibility's dropping. We're losing mirage definition." And still, Dylan stood motionless. He wasn't blinking fast. He wasn't panicked. He was watching the dust settle, not swirl. He crouched beside a strip of canvas tied to a rod in the ground. It wasn't moving with the wind. It twitched, first. Right then, dipped sharply left. Clara saw it too. "What does that mean?" she asked. He pointed toward the center of the range. The low-level crosswind just reversed. And there's a vertical updraft, forming behind the ridge. If someone fires now, they'll miss by 4 feet minimum. Mason, overhearing, stepped closer. "Sir, if this storm builds into a full silt wall, we'll have 0 chance to get clean range data." Dylan looked at him, not judging, not correcting. Just reading. "You're nervous. I'm adapting. Same thing if you're honest." Mason hesitated. "Then you want to run the shot?" Dylan shook his head. "No." He turned to the unit. "I want you to." There was a pause, a ripple of confusion through the squad. Dylan pointed to Morales, the youngest. "You're up. You've been closest in wind readings all week." Morales looked around. "Me, you. But no but. You know the wind. You just haven't trusted it yet." Morales dropped to prone, adjusting his body, eyeing through the scope, but the landscape was smeared like wet paint. He turned. "I can't see the mirage." "You don't need to," Dylan said. "Feel the delay between gusts. Time your breath to the rhythm. Watch the grass. Not the one closest, the one 20 yards left. That's your true vector." Clara watched, breath held. Morales clicked left, adjusted one MOA down, then waited, and waited, then fired. Ting. A hit. A clean center mass strike at 800 yards, in a sandstorm. The Marines cheered. Mason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Clara turned to Dylan, eyes wide. "You gave him the wind." "No," Dylan said quietly. "I gave him permission to listen to it. But nature wasn't finished." Within minutes, the wind shifted again, this time vertical. Columns of grit lifted into the air like reverse waterfalls. The flags twisted violently, and the sand began moving sideways. Then came the drop. A wall of yellow swept across the base like an avalanche. Clara grabbed her headset. All units returned to base immediately. Voices crackled back. "Visibility 0. We're disoriented." Mason turned. "We've got 3 men stranded between the 500 and 700 marks." The storm was swallowing the range. Without a word, Dylan pulled a cloth around his mouth, secured his goggles, and stepped into the wall of dust. Clara reached out. "Wait," but he was already gone. Inside the storm, the world collapsed into sound and sensation. Dylan moved with practiced slowness, feet finding the ground like sonar. His hands traced the edges of the rope barriers, feeling vibration more than pulling tension. He found the first Marine crouched against a small elevation dip shielding his face. Dylan knelt, spoke low but clear. "We're moving." Led by instinct, he guided him 10 yards, then signaled him to hunker in place. He returned into the storm, found the second, closer to the firing mound. One more. The third was face down, disoriented, crawling in the wrong direction. Dylan dropped beside him, grabbed his wrist, and pulled him into shelter behind a small elevation mound. He shouted into his ear, "Don't fight it. Feel the pull. Let it lead you." Somehow, through blindness, they moved. 20 minutes later, 3 Marines stumbled into the base perimeter, coughing, shaking, but whole. Dylan followed behind, coated in dust jacket flapping in the wind like a war-torn flag. Clara ran to him. "Are you?" "I'm fine," he said, wiping grit from his eyes. "They're better." Mason walked over slowly. His uniform was coated, his jaw tight. "Sir," he said, then stopped, swallowed. "You didn't have to go in there yourself." Dylan's voice was calm. "I didn't go for them," he paused. "I went because someday you'll have to. And I needed you to see how it's done." Mason nodded slowly. Clara looked at Dylan, his face streaked with dirt sweat and something harder to name. Stillness. Even in chaos, he was anchored. That night, Clara brought a flask of real coffee to the shed. Dylan sat cleaning faith dust, clogging the grooves of her bolt housing. He glanced up. "You ever seen a vertical shear like that before?" "No," she said, sitting beside him. "And I've read every training manual in the system." He looked at her. "Now you've felt one." She took a sip, then added almost without thinking, "You didn't flinch once out there?" He didn't smile. "I learned a long time ago, if you panic, the wind panics with you." They sat in silence for a while. Then Clara whispered, "You keep saving people." Dylan stared into the dark. "No," he said. "I just walk toward what everyone else is stepping back from." She turned to him, and this time, she didn't hide the emotion in her voice. "And who walks toward you?" He didn't answer, but the question lingered like dust after a storm. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the wind. Dust coated every surface from rifle stocks to stair railings, like a gray hush laid over the world. Even the Marines spoke softer the next morning, as if not to wake something that hadn't yet settled. The training range was quiet. So was Dylan Cole. He hadn't shown up for the morning wind drills. No quiet footfalls, no rolled cloth, no steady voice cutting through the haze. At first, Clara thought he might just be resting. After all, he'd pulled 3 Marines out of a full sand wall the day before and returned without so much as a cough. But when noon came, and he still hadn't surfaced, something in her stirred, not panic, but an ache of worry disguised as curiosity. She made her way to the far side of the maintenance yard, past the oil drums and decommissioned solar rigs toward the old prefab container that Dylan sometimes used as a workspace. The door was slightly ajar. She hesitated. Knocked once. No answer. She stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by a narrow side window streaked with grit. The air was still thick with the scent of oiled metal and desert dust. And there, at a small metal desk, sat Dylan, hunched forward, pen in hand, scribbling slowly onto a lined sheet of paper. He didn't notice her at first. Or maybe he did, and chose not to react. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to speak or retreat. But then she saw it just enough of the page to read the first line. "Camilla, darling, today I almost didn't write you." Her breath caught. She stepped back quietly, ready to give him his space, but his voice stopped her. You can stay." It was soft, tired, not embarrassed. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said. "You didn't." He set the pen down, gently exhaled. She entered slowly, stood beside the workbench. The desk was worn, scratched, dented. One corner had a dent the size of a .308 casing. "How long have you been writing her?" she asked. Dylan leaned back in the chair. "Every day since I left active duty. Some she gets in the mail. Most I keep. Not because I don't want her to read them, but because some things are better written than received." Clara looked down at the pages. There were dozens, stacks of them neatly bundled, tied with a simple twine. "You're building a library," he nodded, "of thoughts I never had time to say out loud." She reached for the top sheet, hesitated. He gave a slight nod. She read silently. "Some days the wind listens. Some days it fights back. But I keep whispering into it, hoping you'll hear me even if I'm 200 miles away. Every time I make a good shot, I imagine it brushing your cheek instead of steel." Clara stopped, swallowed. "You write like a poet." "I shoot like one too," he said, only half smiling. She traced the edge of the paper, then looked at him. Really looked. "You're lonely." It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. "There's a kind of loneliness," he said, "that doesn't feel like emptiness. It just feels like weight. Like carrying something for so long that you forget you can put it down. And Camilla, she's my center of gravity." He stood. Now, walked toward the window, stared out at the dust-veiled hills. "I missed most of her life trying to protect other people's. By the time I came back, she didn't recognize my voice, didn't want me tucking her in. Called her grandma Mom for almost a year." He turned slowly. "So now I write. Because if one day she decides she wants to know who I was, it'll be here." Clara moved closer. "You've built your own legacy." "No, just a paper trail for her to follow home if she ever gets lost." The room fell quiet, and in that silence, something softened between them. Not romantic tension. Not yet. Just the dissolving of old walls. She sat beside him now, shoulder to shoulder. "Do you ever write anything?" "Just for you." Dylan paused, then opened a side drawer, pulled out a smaller bundle. Fewer pages, written in tighter script, more fragmented. He handed her one. She read, "Sometimes still wake up and reach for the rifle first, not the light switch. It's muscle memory. But so is grief. And another, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of never being known." Clara blinked away a tear. "You're more known than you think." They sat like that for a long while, sharing a kind of silence no training exercise could teach, the kind that spoke of wounds, not bandaged, only witnessed. Eventually, Dylan gathered the pages back into their twine-bound homes. He looked at her with steady, open eyes. "Don't mistake calm for peace, Clara. I'm still learning how to breathe." She touched his wrist, right where the tattoo read, "For my daughter." "We all are." He nodded. And outside, beyond the walls, the desert wind stirred, not wild this time, but gentle, like breath through open hands. The news came in a manila folder. Colonel Marcus Hayes arrived that morning with 2 aides and an envelope marked Operational Memorandum, Internal Use Only. He didn't step onto the range with ceremony or applause. He walked the perimeter quietly, eyes scanning the Marines going through their warm-up drills, a team now radically different from the one he'd first visited. Focused. Fluid. Listening. At the far end of the line, Dylan Cole stood beside Private Morales, guiding his hand not to fire, but to wait, to feel the silence between gusts. Only after Morales made the shot, a solid mid-ring hit at 200 yards, did Dylan nod satisfied. Now he said, "You're not shooting a bullet. You're releasing a whisper." Morales smiled. A real one. That's when Hayes approached. Cole. Dylan turned. "You're interrupting my poetry lesson, Colonel." Hayes offered a rare grin. "This'll only take a stanza." He handed over the envelope. Dylan didn't open it immediately. "What is it?" "The wind doctrine has been updated," Hayes said. "Joint Training Command voted unanimously. Your methodology will be adopted as a foundational phase in all advanced sniper programs. Not a supplement, a standard." Around them, the wind pressed gently against the flags. "Congratulations, Chief." Dylan glanced down at the envelope, then slowly tucked it into his back pocket, unopened. "I didn't do this for doctrine," I know Hayes said. "That's why it's worth more." Later that day, a formal recognition ceremony was arranged, informal by military standards, but significant nonetheless. No medals, no uniforms. Just the entire sniper unit gathered at the makeshift firing pavilion and a folding table draped in desert camouflage. Clara stood off to the side, clipboard in hand, though she barely looked at it. Her eyes were on Dylan in his olive jacket, same dusty boots, and eyes that still looked more like a mechanic than a mentor. But everyone stood taller when he entered. Hayes cleared his throat. There are some men, he began, whose names appear on plaques, others in footnotes, but a rare few. He looked directly at Dylan. "Live on in the hands and hearts of those they've trained." He gestured to the crowd. "This team you see before you, 2 weeks ago they were accurate. Now they're aware. They don't just read the wind, they hear it. And when the dust rose and panic whispered, they didn't break, because someone taught them that stillness is stronger than noise." He turned back. "And that someone is Dylan Cole." Applause, not thunderous, but honest, weighty, earned. Dylan nodded, politely stepped forward, not to speak behind the mic, Hayes offered, but to stand directly in front of the Marines. "No rank," he said. "No speech. Just a reminder." He looked at Morales, then at Mason, then at Clara. "You don't carry a rifle to prove anything. You carry it to protect something. And if you forget what that is, no scope will save you." A pause. "Then remember, the wind doesn't lie, but it only speaks to those who listen." He stepped back. No fanfare, just silence. And it was enough. After the gathering dispersed, Mason approached, not with salute, but with sincerity. "Sir," he said, voice low, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you credit." Dylan smiled faintly. "You owe me a beer." Mason smirked. "That too. But seriously, I'd like to offer something." He pulled a folded document from his jacket, a request form. "I want you to consider coming back. Not full duty, not classroom, but as a mentor in residence. Train the trainers, shape the future." Dylan took the paper, then slowly handed it back. "I already am." Mason frowned slightly. "I don't follow." Dylan placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. "You're the future, not me. And from where I stand, you're ready." Clara watched the exchange from a distance. She didn't interrupt. She understood what it meant. Dylan wasn't rejecting the offer, he was passing the torch. That evening, as golden hour fell across the base, Clara found Dylan at his usual place. The observation steps, thermos in hand, eyes on the wind. "You turned it down," she said. "I didn't need to accept," he replied. "They've already taken what matters." "Still," she said, sitting beside him, "it's hard to walk away from something with your name on it." "It's not my name," he said quietly. "It's Camilla's. Everything I've done, every shot, every lesson, has been a way of writing her a world where silence is safe again." He sipped the coffee. "I'm not interested in being remembered. I'm interested in making sure they remember why they started." She nodded. Then, after a long pause, "You know, I used to think leadership was about who stood in front. And now I think it's about who steps aside when the time is right." Dylan looked at her. This time he didn't glance away. "And what about you, Lieutenant?" "You done leading from the front?" She smiled. "I'm thinking of learning to walk alongside someone instead." A silence. Then Dylan raised his cup. "To the wind," he said. Clara raised hers. "To those who listen." It had been 3 days since the ceremony. The range was quieter now. The drills still ran, but the tempo had changed. Less urgency, more focus. The Marines walked with lighter shoulders. They no longer chased every wind gust they listened. Dylan Cole had officially stepped back. Unofficially, he was still around. Clara found him not at the range, not at the maintenance shed, but in a place she never would have expected. The base gardening depot. A modest greenhouse behind the mess hall, mostly used by off-duty kitchen staff to grow herbs, small peppers, and tomatoes for the civilian menu. He stood between 2 wooden racks, brows furrowed, holding a packet of heirloom tomato seeds in one hand and a short wooden trowel in the other. She approached quietly, unsure whether to speak. He noticed her anyway. "Never thought choosing a tomato would feel like tactical planning," he murmured. Clara smiled. "Is this your next battlefield?" "Something like that." She stepped beside him, eyeing the tray of seed packets he'd already sorted: lettuce, snap peas, thyme, and basil. "I didn't know you gardened." "I don't," he said. "Not really." He paused. "But I remember my grandfather's hands always smelled like mint and dirt. After Vietnam, he didn't speak much, just planted things. I think that's how he stayed human." She watched him flip the packet over and study the planting instructions like they were rifle specs. You could have gone anywhere after what happened. "You chose this," he shrugged. "There's something honest about growing things. You can't fake it. You water too much, it drowns. You rush it, it breaks. Everything has its own pace." He turned to her, more serious now. "Like people." She nodded slowly. He moved to a small wooden planter box and began filling it with fresh soil. Clara leaned against the frame. "So, why tomatoes?" He chuckled. "Because they're fussy." Fussy. They need warmth, but not too much. Shade, but not full cover. They hate being crowded. You plant them too close together, and they strangle each other. He pressed his thumb into the soil, forming a small crater. Turns out even fruit needs space to breathe. Clara watched his hand, slow, steady, deliberate. Sounds like a metaphor. He looked up at her, smiling faintly. It's all metaphor. They spent the next hour in easy conversation, not about war or doctrine, but about roots. About the way memory clings to scent. How certain songs crack open forgotten doors. How silence, when shared, becomes something sacred. At one point, Clara crouched beside him, helping plant a row of basil. Their hands brushed in the soil. Neither pulled away. Not out of hesitation, but because the touch felt natural, like placing a stone exactly where it belonged. As the sun shifted in the sky, Dylan leaned back and wiped sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "You ever wonder?" He asked why the strongest things grow in broken ground. Clara thought for a moment. "Because nothing is left to lose." He nodded. "And because the ground stops pretending." She looked at the row of fragile sprouts near the far end of the bed. "You think that's us? Broken ground? I think we've stopped pretending." She met his gaze, and for a long moment neither spoke. Not because they were afraid of what might be said, but because everything that mattered had already been understood. Later, as they cleaned their hands with rough towels, Clara asked, "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Dylan looked up. "You mean after the garden, after the base, after this chapter?" He didn't answer immediately. "Then I've thought about building a small cabin in Montana, or maybe New Mexico. Somewhere the wind still speaks." She smiled. "And tomatoes?" He raised an eyebrow. "Obviously." She paused. voice quieter now, and would there be space for visitors? He didn't smile. Not fully. But his answer came without hesitation. There's always space. That evening, Clara passed by the range and saw Morales Mason and 3 others practicing wind calls without rifles. Just hands raised to feel direction, eyes scanning shadows, bodies still. She smiled, not because they were imitating Dylan, but because they had made the lesson their own. She looked back toward the greenhouse, where a single figure still moved in the fading light, crouched beside the soil, whispering to a garden only just beginning. And in that image, she saw it clearly. Hope wasn't loud. It didn't arrive like orders or applause. It arrived like roots, slow, silent, persistent, and always, always seeking the sun. The air was still that morning, not absent, just resting. Like even the wind knew the chapter was closing. The Marines gathered at the range early, though there were no orders, no drills scheduled, just a quiet understanding that today was different. Today was Dylan's last. Not a farewell. Not officially. He hadn't made an announcement, hadn't packed ceremoniously, hadn't shaken hands or posed for pictures. He was just easing away, like the wind itself, never loud when it leaves. Clara stood at the observation deck, coffee in hand, watching the team begin their self-run warm-ups. Mason was walking the line now, calling wind shifts, correcting foot placements. Morales was teaching a newer recruit how to read the shimmer, just like Dylan had once done for him. The doctrine lived on. But the man behind it was stepping into the quiet. She turned toward the far end of the range where a figure stood near the edge of the dune. Dylan. He wasn't holding faith today. He wasn't watching the targets. He was just listening, the same way he had always taught. She walked toward him, her boots leaving narrow tracks in the dust-softened earth. He heard her, of course. He always did. "You're really going," she said. He nodded slow. "The garden needs me." She smiled. "The tomatoes?" And the quiet. A long pause. "You told me once," Clara said, "that some truths are better felt than spoken." He turned to her now. "And some goodbyes don't need a name." She looked away, blinking fast. "You changed everything here, Dylan." "No," he said gently. "They did. I just helped them hear what was already there." Another silence. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a folded slip of paper. "A letter?" he asked. "A sentence," she said, in case Camilla ever wants to know what kind of man her father really was. He unfolded it. It read, "He was the kind of man who never raised his voice, but still made the wind turn toward him." Dylan folded it, carefully tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket just over his heart. "I'll save that for her," from behind a voice called out. "Sir Mason!" He jogged up a little breathless, saluted reflexively, then caught himself and dropped his hand. "Sorry. Habit." Dylan smirked. "Old habits make good roots. I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything. You changed the way I lead, the way I listen." He offered his hand. Dylan took it firm. Brief. "Led with less noise, Captain. It echoes farther." Mason nodded. "Yes, sir." He stepped back, gave one last look, then turned and walked away, leaving just Clara and Dylan again. The wind stirred slightly. A faint whisper. Clara looked toward the hills. "They named the new range protocol after you, you know." Dylan chuckled. "Let me guess something dramatic." She smiled. "The whisper range." His expression softened. "They actually called it that." She nodded. "It suits you." He was quiet for a moment. "Then maybe the next generation will fire fewer rounds and make each one matter more." At the top of the dune, Dylan looked back one last time. The Marines were still training, but now in pairs, correcting each other, gently reading the flags, adjusting their stances, not just from readings, but from instinct. And at the center of it all, no instructor, just the wind. He turned to Clara. I'm not good at endings. She smiled. Good, because I don't think this is one. He nodded once slowly, then stepped forward. Not with a speech, not with a wave, just a glance over his shoulder, and a final sentence. The wind still speaks, Clara, she answered without hesitation. So do you. And then he walked. Across the range, past the flags, beyond the perimeter. Each step steady, quiet, deliberate. The sun poured gold across his shoulders. And for a brief moment, as the breeze caught the edges of his jacket, it looked almost as if the wind itself was walking with him. Back on the range, Clara stood alone for a long time. Then slowly she turned and joined the others. Not to lead, but to listen. To teach what she had learned. To become what he had shown her was possible. And far off in the distance, beyond the edge of drills and doctrine and dust, the wind still whispered, Before you go, I'd love to know where are you watching from tonight. Tell me in the comments below. It always warms my heart to see people from so many corners of the world come together for stories like this. If this story touched you, even just a little, please consider subscribing to Soul Moment Story. Every week we share new tales of kindness, quiet strength, and the small miracles that still live among us. Thank you truly for spending your time here, for listening, for feeling, and for believing that goodness still matters. Until next time, may the wind whisper peace wherever you are.